Right now, you are about to have your entire understanding of British history completely shattered. Not gently revised, not politely updated, but shattered at the foundation. Because for centuries, science laughed at one of the oldest, most stubborn claims in the world, the idea that the Welsh are the true, original Britons. It was dismissed as folklore, as romantic nationalism, as the kind of comforting myth that every small nation tells itself to survive in the shadow of a larger, more powerful neighbor. But then, in the silent hum of a genetics laboratory, a team of scientists pulled something out of the DNA that no one expected, and it didn't just prove the legend true. It revealed a secret far more ancient, far more shocking, and far more significant than anyone had dared to imagine. The real genetic origin of the Welsh is not what you think. It rewrites the entire peopling of Britain, and it starts not with kings or invaders, but with ice, with waves of migration, and with a mountain fortress carved not just from rock, but from flesh and blood. This is the story that history books tried to bury, not through conspiracy, but through the simple, stubborn inertia of a narrative that was too tidy to question. And today, that story finally gets told in full. The mainstream story of Britain is a story of invasion. It's the story we all learned in school, the story that seems so obvious, so self-evident, that we rarely stop to question it. We are taught about the Romans, who built the walls and the roads, whose legions marched across the island and left behind their villas, their baths, and their straight, unforgiving roads. We are taught about the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who sailed from the northern European coast in their longboats, who pushed the old inhabitants westward, and who forged the very idea of England itself, the land of the Angles. Then came the Vikings, with their dragon-proud longships and their lightning raids, their settlements in the north and east, their Danelaw and their legacy of place names that still dot the map of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And finally, the Normans in 1066, a single, seismic event that seems to cap the story of the British gene pool, a clean, dramatic endpoint to the era of mass migration. This narrative is so powerful, so deeply embedded in our historical consciousness, that it carries with it a central, unspoken assumption. That assumption is this: that the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was a transformative, near-total replacement event, that the old, Celtic-speaking population of what is now England was swept away, culturally and demographically, by the waves of Germanic settlers who arrived in the 5th and 6th centuries. The Welsh, in this story, are the survivors, the remnants, the defeated and romanticized leftovers who held out in the highlands of the West, a living museum of a bygone era, a people frozen in time while the rest of Britain moved on. This is the comfortable, simplistic picture. It's a picture that flatters the English narrative of progress and patronizes the Welsh as a charming backward relic. But it misses a crucial, invisible dimension. It misses the granite-hard truth preserved in every cell of a Welshman's body. Previous knowledge, based on archaeology and linguistics, could only tell us about pots and place names. It could piece together the fragments of broken pottery, trace the distribution of hill forts and burial mounds, and reconstruct the slow evolution of language from Brythonic to Old Welsh, to the living tongue spoken today. But it could not peer into the deep, biological narrative of the people themselves. It could not read the story written in the very blueprint of life. And what was missed, what was spectacularly, profoundly missed, was the sheer, staggering depth of continuity. The story isn't just about a tribe that got pushed west 1,500 years ago by the advancing Anglo-Saxons. That's the shallow, recent chapter. The real story is one that begins 10,000 years earlier, a story of survival against the most brutal forces nature can muster, a story of ice sheets a kilometer thick grinding across the landscape, of sea levels rising and swallowing entire hunting grounds, of forests spreading across what was once frozen tundra. It's a story that makes the Anglo-Saxon migrations look like a recent footnote in a much older, much more epic book. And it's a story that, until very recently, was completely invisible. So, let's begin the investigation not with history books, but with the fundamental alphabet of life, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, scattered across the human genome. These are the tiny variations, the single-letter changes in the genetic code that make each of us unique. They are the raw data of population genetics, the building blocks of ancestry. And imagine, if you will, a vast, detailed map of Britain, not of roads and cities, but of genetic variation. Not a map drawn by cartographers, but a map drawn by the accumulated inheritance of thousands of generations. This is exactly what a landmark study achieved. Published in the journal Nature. In 2015, and led by Dr. Stephen Leslie, the study was a monumental undertaking, one of the finest-grained analyses of a national population ever conducted. The team analyzed genome-wide SNP data from approximately 2,000 individuals across the United Kingdom, all carefully selected from rural areas, all of whose grandparents were born within 80 kilometers of each other. This wasn't a study of the recently moved, of the urban mobile, of the people whose ancestry had been scrambled by the Industrial Revolution and modern commuting patterns. It was a deep probe into the pre-industrial, rooted population structure of Britain. It was an attempt to see the genetic landscape as it existed before the railways, before the factories, before the great churning of the modern era. The results were a cartographer's dream and a historian's challenge. When the genetic data was plotted, the map of the UK exploded into a stunning mosaic of distinct clusters. Each region, each ancient kingdom, each pocket of the old landscape revealed itself as a distinct genetic entity, with clear boundaries and subtle gradations. And right there, in the west, a clear, sharp, and undeniable genetic cluster emerged. It was not a fuzzy borderland, not a gradual blending from one population to another. It was a wall. The Welsh individuals formed a genetic group that was profoundly separate from their English neighbors. Visualize it on screen, a map of the UK, with the English clusters blending into one another in a gradient from south to north, a smooth continuum of genetic variation running from Cornwall to Northumberland. But then, the Welsh border illuminates like a bright dividing line, a genetic cliff edge where one population stops and another, entirely distinct population begins. This is the genetic signature of an ancient, physical, and cultural barrier. The Cambrian Mountains, a rugged spine running north to south through the heart of Wales, were not just a geographical feature. They were a genetic fortress wall, a refugia that preserved an older British gene pool from the demographic tides that washed over the lowlands of England. The study found no significant Anglo-Saxon genetic input in many of the Welsh samples tested. None. Zero. The genetic ghost of the Germanic migrations was absent. In stark contrast, the analysis of Central and Eastern English populations showed a clear genetic contribution from a source population that looked remarkably like modern-day people from the northern Netherlands and northwestern Germany. The genetic ghost of the Anglo-Saxon migration was everywhere in England, a powerful, detectable 30 to 40% trace in many areas, a massive demographic footprint left by the settlers who crossed the North Sea. But the signal decayed rapidly as you moved west. As you cross the modern border into Wales, the signal fades to a whisper, and in many parts of the country, to absolute silence. The DNA didn't just suggest a story of resistance, it proved a story of deep, biological isolation. It provided the first hard, quantifiable evidence that the Welsh are not just culturally distinct, but genetically distinct in a way that goes far deeper than language or custom. They are, in a very real sense, a separate population, preserved by geography against the tides of migration that reshaped the rest of the island. But to understand the real origin of the Welsh, we must go much deeper than the echoes of the Dark Ages. We must travel back through the millennia, using the two most powerful time capsules in the human genome: the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child. These two lineages are the twin pillars of deep ancestry, the unbroken threads that connect us to our most distant forebears. Let's start with the paternal line, the story written in the Y DNA. A single haplogroup, known as R1bL21, or R1b1A2A1A2C in its full scientific nomenclature, dominates the Welsh male lineage. In some samples from North and Mid Wales, the frequency of this marker exceeds 60 to 70%. Think about that number. Think about what it means. Nearly 3/4 of men in some of the most deeply Welsh-speaking regions carry a direct, unbroken paternal line back to the same ancient patriarchs, the same founding fathers who arrived on this island thousands of years ago. This is not a generic Celtic marker, as was once lazily assumed. The early days of genetic research were crude, using broad brushstrokes that lumped vast populations together under simple labels. But R1bL21 is a specific, deeply branching subclade of the much larger R1b family that dominates Western Europe. It is not a catch-all term, it is a precise genetic fingerprint, a signature of a particular demographic event at a particular moment in prehistory. That event was the arrival of the bell beaker culture. This is the key turning point. the moment when the genetic foundations of the Welsh were truly laid down. The Bellbeaker people weren't just a few traders or a scattering of migrants. Ancient DNA studies of skeletal remains have now shown that this was a massive folk movement, a replacement-level event that swept across the British Isles around 4,500 years ago. They came from the continent, bringing with them new metalworking technologies, copper first, then bronze, a new pottery style characterized by the distinctive beaker-shaped vessels that give the culture its name, and a new way of being, a new social structure, a new relationship with the land. The genetic evidence is stark. The Neolithic farmers who had built Stonehenge, who had erected the great megalithic monuments and cultivated the first fields, saw their male lineages largely replaced. The Beaker people did not absorb them, they displaced them. The Y chromosome lineages of the Neolithic farmers, once widespread across Britain, nearly vanish from the record in the centuries following the Beaker arrival. It is one of the most dramatic population replacements in European prehistory, and it set the stage for everything that followed. And in the highlands of what would become Wales, the descendants of these Beaker migrants found a sanctuary. The R1b L21 lineage they carried became the dominant, foundational paternal bloodline. It is a deep-rooted Atlantic ancestry, laid down before the Celtic languages as we define them even fully crystallized, before the Druids, before the hill forts, before the very word Briton was ever spoken. It is a lineage of the western seaboard, connecting the Welsh not to the Germanic tribes of the east, but to the ancient peoples of Ireland, Brittany, and the Atlantic coast of Spain. This is a genetic foundation that is not 1,500 years old, but 3 times that age, and it still pulses powerfully in the veins of Welsh men today. Walk through the streets of Aberystwyth or Caernarfon, and you are walking through a living gallery of Bronze Age ancestry. But the stories of a population are never just male. The female line, traced through mitochondrial DNA, whispers an even older, more profound tale of survival. The mtDNA is a tiny, circular piece of genetic material, separate from the DNA in the nucleus of our cells, and it is inherited exclusively from mother to child. A father passes on his mtDNA to no one. A mother passes it on to all her children, but only her daughters will pass it to the next generation. It is the pure maternal thread, unshuffled by the recombination, that mixes the rest of our genome each generation. And this thread allows us to trace a direct, unbroken line of mothers, stretching back into the deep past, back beyond the reach of written language, beyond the reach of memory, back to the very beginnings of human presence in Britain. And in Wales, 2 very specific maternal haplogroups tell a powerful story. The first is haplogroup H, the most common female lineage in Europe, a lineage of the Upper Paleolithic and later expansions, a broad and successful matriline that spread across the continent as the ice retreated. But the second is far more revealing. Haplogroup U, and specifically its subclade U5. U5 is a relic. It is a genetic fossil of the very first modern humans to recolonize the European continent after the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age, around 20,000 years ago. Picture that world, a world of ice and snow, where glaciers covered Scandinavia and the British Isles under sheets of ice up to a kilometer thick, where the sea level was so low that Britain was not an island at all, but a peninsula of continental Europe. And then, slowly, imperceptibly, the climate began to warm. The ice sheets began their slow, grinding retreat, a retreat that took thousands of years, a retreat that transformed the landscape from frozen wasteland to habitable terrain. And as the ice retreated, small bands of hunter-gatherers followed the migrating herds of reindeer and wild horse north. They moved into a raw, new, and empty land, a land scoured clean by the glaciers, a land of meltwater lakes and stunted vegetation, a land that would gradually, over millennia, become the green and pleasant Britain we know today. They were the pioneer people of Britain, the first human beings to set foot on this land after the Ice Age, the original ancestors of the island's population. And their direct maternal descendants, the carriers of U5, are still here. They are found in Britain, but they are found at a notably elevated frequency in populations like the Welsh. This is a line of mothers that stretches back 10,000 years or more, a line that witnessed the transformation of a vast frozen tundra into the wooded island of Britain, a line that hunted in the forests that would later become the drowned land of Doggerland, the great submerged plain that once connected Britain to continental Europe, now lying beneath the gray waters of the North Sea, a line that saw the sea levels rise, that saw the island cut off from the mainland, that saw the first farmers arrive with their crops and their animals. When you look at a Welsh person carrying the U5 marker, you are not just looking at a descendant of the Celts. You are looking at the unmixed, direct maternal thread of a Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer, a person whose ancestors were gazing at the retreating glaciers from a camp on the very edge of the habitable world. This is not a story of invasion, it is a story of deep, aboriginal continuity, a thread of ancestry that runs back to the very dawn of human settlement in Britain. The Neolithic farmers, who arrived around 6,000 years ago from the Near East, bringing agriculture, pottery, and their own maternal lineages like haplogroup J, added another layer to this maternal tapestry. But the ancient U5 signal was not extinguished. It was folded in, a persistent, resilient echo of the first islanders, preserved in the high mountain valleys of the West, where the grip of the past is always a little stronger, where the old ways and the old bloodlines endure longer than in the lowlands. But why? What changed everything? What was the mechanism, the process, the force that preserved this ancient genetic heritage while the rest of Britain was transformed? This is the twist that shatters the simplistic narrative of a single Celtic tribe. The real genetic origin of the Welsh is not a simple story of a single people arriving from a single place in a single moment. The Anglo-Saxon migration was not the event that created the Welsh, it was the event that revealed them. This is the crucial insight, the inversion of the traditional narrative. The real twist is that the genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh was shaped by geography long before it was shaped by history. The Cambrian Mountains acted as a genetic sieve for millennia, not just centuries. The waves of migration that so profoundly reshaped the lowland gene pool of England, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, simply crashed against this ancient rocky fortress with minimal long-term biological impact. The mountains were a wall, and the wall held. The genetic study by Mark Thomas and colleagues in 2012, examining the genetic legacy of the Anglo-Saxon influx, provided the stark, comparative evidence. It found that while central and eastern England showed a massive genetic contribution from continental Germanic sources, the modern Welsh populations retained the highest proportion of pre-Saxon British ancestry in England and Wales. The exact percentage is a matter of ongoing statistical modeling, a topic of lively debate among population geneticists, with some estimates suggesting the ancient British component in Wales is over 80%, compared to figures that can drop below 50% in parts of eastern England. Compare those numbers. In the east, the genetic signal of the original Britons is faint, diluted, nearly drowned out by the noise of subsequent migrations. In Wales, it is dominant, overwhelming, the loudest signal in the genetic symphony. This isn't just a faint trace of the old Britons, a ghostly echo detectable only with the most sensitive instruments. In the genetic makeup of the Welsh, the Old Britons are the signal, and the Anglo-Saxons are the noise. The twist is identity-shattering because it decouples Celtic identity from a simple continental origin. The ancestors of the Welsh were not a single Celtic tribe that arrived from Central Europe in the Iron Age, as older historical models posited. That model, popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, imagined waves of Celtic warriors sweeping across Europe, bringing their language and culture to the far corners of the continent. But the genetics tells a different story. The genetic bedrock of the Welsh is a complex three-part mixture: the indomitable Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the pioneering Neolithic farmers, and the prolific Bronze Age bell-beaker people. This was the British gene pool, a unique blend forged on the island itself, not imported wholesale from abroad. The Anglo-Saxons didn't push the Celts west. They were the new arrivals who, in the east, largely replaced a population that was already there. The Welsh are, in a very real biological sense, the most direct living descendants of the people who built Britain, the people who cleared the forests, raised the megaliths, and gave the island its name. This means if your family bloodline traces back to the heart of Wales, you are not just Welsh. You are a living, breathing representative of the original British genome, a genetic monument to a pre-Saxon, pre-Roman world that has been almost entirely erased from the DNA of lowland Britain. Your ancestors didn't just survive the Anglo-Saxon invasions, they ignored them. They endured, they persisted, and they passed on their genetic legacy to you. Let's now take a deep dive into one specific lineage, the Y chromosome marker R1b L21, and compare its story across the waters to truly understand the epic scale of this Atlantic connection. The dominance of R1b L21 in Wales is a phenomenon that creates a genetic bridge across the Irish Sea. A bridge that has nothing to do with modern politics and everything to do with ancient prehistory. In Ireland, the very same marker is extraordinarily prevalent, often reaching frequencies of 80 or 90% in northern and western counties. In Scotland, it is the defining signature of the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and the Western Islands. And in Brittany, the Celtic region of northwestern France, it is equally dominant. Plot these points on a map and you see a pattern. A vast Atlantic arc. A crescent of shared ancestry running from the rugged coast of Galway to the granite shores of Brittany, with Wales at its center. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. The genetic data reveals a vast, interconnected Atlantic maritime world, a community of shared ancestry that existed long before the Roman Empire, long before the formal definition of Celtic peoples by classical authors. These were the seafaring cultures of the Atlantic Bronze Age, moving not just goods, but genes, along the coastal trade routes that connected the tin mines of Cornwall, the gold of Ireland, and the copper of Iberia. The sea, far from being a barrier, was a highway, a conduit for the exchange of people, ideas, and bloodlines. The Welsh, far from being an isolated backwater, were a central node in this ancient Western network, a hub of maritime trade and genetic exchange. The deep genetic similarity between a Welshman from Pembrokeshire and an Irishman from County Cork is not a sign of medieval migration, of Irish settlers crossing the sea in the early Middle Ages. It is a sign of a shared, deep Bronze Age heritage that makes them, in a paternal sense, closer kin than the Welshman is to an Englishman from Suffolk, whose male lineage may trace back to an Anglo-Saxon settler from Jutland, from the very different genetic world of the continental North Sea. This is the power of population genetics, to render the old maps of history obsolete. The political border between Wales and England is a recent, medieval construction, a line drawn on the map by kings and treaties. The genetic border is an ancient, geological one, a deep water channel that separated two different demographic worlds for millennia. The English Channel, in contrast, was a late-arriving cultural boundary, a division that only became significant in the relatively recent past. The real genetic cleavage in Britain for thousands of years was not between North and South, not between Celt and Saxon, but between the Atlantic West and the continental East. The Welsh are genetically Eastern Atlantic, not Western European. This is a profound reorientation of their place in the world, a shift from the margins of European history to the center of an ancient Atlantic civilization. But this deep dive into the genetic story of the Welsh also reveals a more recent and equally fascinating chapter of isolation. The 2020 paper in Nature on the population genomics of the Viking world, led by Dr. Ashot Margarian, sequenced the genomes of hundreds of Viking-era skeletons from across Europe, providing an unprecedented view of the Scandinavian diaspora and its impact on the populations it touched. While the study's primary focus was Scandinavia, its findings had dramatic implications for the rest of the British Isles. The study confirmed a massive Norse genetic footprint in the northern and western Isles of Scotland, in the Shetlands and Orkneys, and the Hebrides, where Viking settlement was intense and enduring. It confirmed a substantial Norse presence in Ireland, particularly in the coastal towns and cities founded by Viking raiders, Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Limerick. And it confirmed a clear Norse signal in the Danelaw region of England, the area roughly north and east of a line from London to Chester, the territory ceded to Viking control in the 9th century. We see the genetic signatures of Viking settlers in these places, a clear signal of the Scandinavian diaspora that swept across the North Sea, leaving an indelible mark on the populations it encountered. But when you look at the genetic data for Wales, the signal is remarkably faint. The Viking tide, which reshaped so much of Britain and Ireland's genetic coastline, barely lapped at the shores of Wales. A few coastal raids, a few place names along the coast, a few scattered archaeological finds, but no significant genetic settlement. The mountains, once again, had served their purpose. The same physical barrier that had buffered the Anglo-Saxon gene flow also acted as a shield against the Viking incursions. The Vikings, like the Anglo-Saxons before them, found the Welsh Highlands too difficult, too remote, too uninviting for large-scale settlement. They raided the coasts, took their plunder, and moved on, leaving the genetic heart of Wales untouched. The result is a double, reinforcing layer of isolation, The Welsh gene pool was not only protected from the major Germanic migration from the east, but also from the major Scandinavian migration from the north and east. While the rest of Britain was being genetically reshaped by wave after wave of invaders, Wales remained a genetic time capsule, a living reflection of the island's earliest population. This makes the Welsh genetic profile a truly exceptional control sample, a pocket of the past that allows scientists to reconstruct the genetic baseline of pre-Roman Britain with a level of confidence that would be impossible elsewhere. Every new study of ancient DNA in Britain, from the Mesolithic Cheddar Man to the Beaker burials, is contextualized by the living legacy in Wales. The modern Welsh population provides a reference point, a baseline against which the ancient DNA can be compared. They are not just a modern nation, they are a living archaeological dig site, a continuous biological experiment in isolation and survival. The DNA of Cheddar Man, the famous Mesolithic skeleton found in a Somerset cave, shows a closer affinity to modern Welsh populations than to modern English populations. The ancient and the modern are connected in a direct, measurable, and profound way. But what does this mean for the very human story of identity, history, and belonging? This is where we must widen the lens from the microscopic to the philosophical, from the laboratory to the living room, from the data set to the human heart. The scientific revelation that the Welsh are the most direct genetic descendants of the earliest Britons is a powerful validation of a cultural memory that has been dismissed for centuries. The myth, the legend, the stubborn folk claim of being the original people of the land turns out to be biologically true. This is a profound moment of reconnection between science and identity. For a Welsh person, the DNA in their blood is not just a set of random markers, a series of letters on a laboratory report. It is a document. It is a biography written in a language of 4 letters. A biography that tells the story of a hunter shivering in a cave in the Elwy Valley as the ice retreated, of a Neolithic farmer clearing a field in the shadow of a burial chamber, of a Bronze Age metalworker trading gold across the sea, and of a Romano-British farmer watching the lights of a new Anglo-Saxon village flicker in the lowlands below. The genetic isolation imposed by the mountains was not a cultural failure, a failure to keep up with the progressive East. It was a biological miracle of preservation. The Welsh language, the oldest living language in Britain, is the audible, cultural parallel to the silent, genetic continuity in the blood. There is a beautiful symmetry here. The language, a direct descendant of the ancient Brythonic tongue spoken across the island, has survived in the same rugged refugia as the ancient genes. The mountains protected both the speakers and their DNA. This is not a coincidence. It is a holistic pattern of cultural and biological history, a demonstration that language and genes can travel together through time, preserved by the same forces of geography and isolation. The narrative of the Welsh as a defeated, romantic people is thus completely inverted. They are not the losers of history. They are the survivors. They are the genetic and cultural memory keeper of Britain. Every other layer of invasion, Roman, Saxon, Viking, Norman, has washed over the lowlands, leaving its mark, rewriting the genetic code of the people there. But the deep, foundational bedrock of the island persists, in its most concentrated form, in the people of the Welsh mountains. This is a story of profound resilience, a quiet, biological victory against the forces of historical change, a victory that has been achieved not through conquest or empire, but through simple, stubborn endurance. And so, we are left with a new, stunning mosaic of British origins. The genetic map of the UK is not a story of a single people, but of a palimpsest, a parchment written on, scraped off, and written on again. Each wave of migration has left its mark, has written its chapter in the genetic code, has scraped away some of what came before. The story of the Welsh is the deepest, most enduring layer of that palimpsest, the text that has undergone the least amount of scraping, the text that can still be read clearly beneath all the later writing. They are a window into the genetic soul of ancient Britain, revealing a complex origin story that goes far beyond the simple label of Celtic. They are a composite of the indomitable first hunters, the pioneering first farmers, and the prolific Atlantic seafarers of the Bronze Age. Their identity is not a single, pure lineage from a mythical Celtic homeland, but a unique and ancient mixture forged on the island itself, a mixture that is the true, original British genome. The real genetic origin of the Welsh is a story of time, of mountains, and of a profound, unbroken biological thread that stretches from the camps of the Ice Age to the valleys of the 21st century. The next time you hear the Welsh language with its ancient, musical cadences, or see the rolling hills of the Cambrian mountains stretching away to the horizon, remember that you are not just looking at a landscape or a culture. You are looking at a living, breathing, genetic masterpiece. A masterpiece of survival. A masterpiece of belonging. A masterpiece that science has finally, completely, and beautifully revealed. And if this secret history of an entire people blew your mind, if the revelation that the Welsh are the true, original Britons has shattered your assumptions about history, identity, and belonging, then you need to hit subscribe right now and smash that bell. Because we are just scratching the surface of the lost genetic stories that are rewriting everything you thought you knew about human history. Drop a comment with what ancient lineage we should decode next. The Basques, the Sami, the Maori. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.